It is my absolute pleasure to introduce, really, she doesn't need any introduction, Dr. Maryanne Wolf, who is joining me for our final chit chat of 2024. What a way to end the year, having a chit chat with you. Maryanne Wolf is a scholar, teacher, and advocate for children and literacy around the world. She is the director of the Centre for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners and Social Justice at UCLA in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. She has authored 170 scientific publications. She has received multiple awards for her contributions to the neuroscience of reading, the major awards from the International Dyslexia Association, and the Einstein Award from the Dyslexia Foundation for her dyslexia research, and the Walter Ong Award and the Alfred Korzybski, not sure if I'm announcing that right, award for her work on the effects of different mediums on the intellectual development of the species. Most recently, she was elected a permanent member of the Pontifical Academy of Science. Congratulations, and thank you so much for giving up some of your time to beam into New Zealand. I know you are incredibly sought after and an incredibly busy lady. So thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Carla. And I know that you personally know how important New Zealand is to me. My visits there have been inspiring, both about the absolute beauty of nature, the country's desire to preserve it, to be an example of what good ecology means, and also the history of your efforts to educate all of your children in the most equitable way across both islands. I've been so impressed, Carla. So even though I try not to give all these podcasts, when I saw yours and it said New Zealand, I thought, absolutely, I must do it.
Oh, thank you so much. Shall we begin our discussion by you explaining to us in relatively simple terms how the brain circuitry differs in individuals with dyslexia compared to those that we might consider more typical readers?
That's a really good place to begin. I will actually quote my colleague Stanislaus Dehaene, whom I know that you have great familiarity with. I will quote him because he gave a wonderful explanation why neuroscience is important for educational practice. And he said that he believed that if teachers and policymakers and parents understood the circuits of the reading brain, we would be much better in our ability to teach what goes into the formation of that circuitry. And so part of my work in my first book, which was called Proust and the Squid, The Story and Science of the Reading Brain, and my latest book, Reader Come Home, The Reading Brain in a Digital World, both of them included a kind of overview of what a circuit for reading is. And it begins with the understanding that there is no one place in the brain for reading, but rather it is a network of connections of parts that do exist in the reading brain. And so we take from this very fundamental insight that the reading brain doesn't exist genetically. It has to be formed. It requires us to help make connections among the genetically original parts of our brain that are involved. And these include our visual areas and attention areas, our language areas, especially phonology, semantics, syntax, and understanding morphology, connected to our conceptual, our cognitive processes. So when you connect vision, language, and cognition to motoric skills as well, you're connecting underlying areas of the brain that are developing from 0 to 5 before reading ever occurs. Now, after reading occurs, there's an additional set of processes that get connected to the circuit. And those are beautiful because they are involving the affective, the ability to connect feeling to thought, to language, to vision. And so you get, even in those early years between 5 and 7 and 8, a primary basic decoding set of connections that are the first reading circuit. Now, that circuit is sometimes best understood as a circuit of circuits. So, all those big 5 rings, if you will, of the reading brain are learning to get connected. And as they get connected, they actually develop each other. So each of those component parts begins to become more developed. So in the visual area, the visual word form area, you're getting more and more letter patterns. You're also getting better connections to language, what the word means, how the word functions grammatically. So over time, you're adding all of these, if you will, more sophisticated parts of those early components. And as that happens, my colleague Alberto Mangel says this best: reading is cumulative. All the knowledge in those 5 components are adding to their development and their connected development, ever more sophisticated, elaborated processes that makes us ultimately capable of what I call deep reading.
Mm.
And I know that'll be a question that you have, but I want to just give you this as a template for understanding that that early first circuit of circuits gets more and more developed, more and more connected, and more sophisticated. Everything builds upon what came before, which
Mm.
means that the more you read, the better you read, the more sophisticated your understanding of reading is. It's a beautiful, what Alberto Mangel says, geometric progression, I would add, of the circuitry.
Amazing. When you said, you said every first circuit of circuits, even explaining
Yes,
it to us like that really helps us to understand that network. And just a couple of those key takeaways were there is no one place in the brain, but it is a network. And so we have to
yes,
understand that we're not just trying to activate one part. You've really
exactly.
explained to us that they
Mhm.
work together, and that if we build one, that's going to help strengthen another part of that circuit
Yes,
as well.
you're absolutely right, Carla. And this is a fundamental understanding that the field of reading and dyslexia research hasn't always understood. Um, the history has been almost scandalously devoted to finding what's the reason why
Mm,
dyslexia exists,
yeah.
as if there weren't multiple ways that that circuit of
Mm,
circuits can be impeded in their development individually of those components, and more importantly, their ability to work together as
mm,
that circuit of circuits. Now, what I try to help people understand, and here we are, we're going to have a brief moment of time for us to try to give, if you will, principles for understanding how that informs educational practice.
mm,
So I
mm,
want to draw a very real implication of this circuit of circuits insight. It means that there is not going to be only one reason why dyslexia exists.
mm,
It means it could be one, two, or multiple reasons. And that also means, and this is even more importantly, that if there's heterogeneity, in how the brain can be impeded or not developing in the same way, our interventions, our educational practice has to be also working on multiple fronts,
Mm,
not just one reason why dyslexia is impeded and not just one emphasis in our intervention. So it's a really important um, insight from neuroscience into heterogeneity, the multiple component nature of the reading circuit of circuits, and the need to address in our interventions and practice
mm,
multiple areas. So
mm.
those are the sort of fundamental principles that we can draw.
It's such a gift, isn't it, when educators really understand that. It's such a gift
Yes,
that they understand that they're not looking for one particular pinpointed aspect or one part of that circuitry, that they understand and that there could be multiple areas that are affected. And in my experience, that helps us to understand why working with individual students or groups of students, or even in a
yes,
classroom setting, why
yes,
students present differently in
different.
their
Yes,
response to instruction.
exactly correct. And I think, Carla, if everyone understands that much, they're going to have new eyes in looking at their students and be able to realize that their work, our collective work as a field, has been progressing in some areas more than others. So you're
Mm,
going to have new eyes at seeing, oh, this is working on, let's say, phoneme awareness and
mhm,
connecting letter sound correspondence, but somehow it's not connecting to understanding what those words mean or
mm,
understanding how those words work grammatically in sentences. So it helps give us two sets of eyes, open to things outside even what we were trained or taught for the last 20 years. It opens our eyes to that, but it also opens our eyes to the fact that our interventions work, but
yes.
they can have a shelf life, if you will,
Mm,
and the student may need other emphases uh, that support what you've done well, but that you need to expand and change, sometimes subtly, sometimes in a large way. And here I will step on a few toes that are dear to me because everyone who does intervention, everyone is trying their very hardest. But sometimes we get locked into one philosophy, if you will, of intervention,
mm,
and we keep doing it and doing it and doing it past the time it's really effective.
mm,
And so we have to be vigilant and looking at the development of our success or our lack of success.
yeah.
So it's a big burden for teachers to understand that there's a bigger picture underlying what we have to do,
Mm.
but that will ultimately be much more satisfying because it will help us understand what each child or each group needs over time.
Mm, mm. And the more and more and more we as educators and other stakeholders really build our knowledge of the circuitry and how that works and what the
Yeah,
implications are when it doesn't work, the more we will be eyes open to
yeah,
coin your term, the more we will be eyes open to respond, to really noticing and responding appropriately to whatever
mhm.
interventions are being implemented.
No, I can remember years and years ago, before I went into this area, I was doing Peace Corps like work in teaching reading. I was a total failure, Carla. I just want you to know, a total failure because I didn't know anything.
Mhm,
And I was just thinking that if I can just get them excited about literature and
mm,
reading, that will be enough to teach them that, because all I have to do in my poor little, uninformed mind in the beginning was give love and
Mhm.
it will beget
Mm.
the acquisition of reading and a love of reading that will then make them better and better. And though I was partially correct, love of reading and stories is so important. That's the
Mm.
affect.
Mm.
It is by no means going to make readers out of about 40% of our kids.
Mm. Yeah. Mm.
But that
Let's.
changed me from an English major, um, and really basically, even before I knew the term whole language or balanced literacy, I had the experience of failure that guided me actually into neuroscience instead of
Mm.
English literature. And that's when all of the insights over the last 30 years have accumulated now in what I would love to give teachers, and that is three things: an understanding of the reading brain circuitry,
Mm.
an understanding of the heterogeneity of dyslexia, and an understanding of how, in this case, the English language works for words
Mm.
from meaning, which is very important, to understanding the principles of letter sound correspondence rules, and how do we understand that words have visual forms, and those visual forms have rhymes and onsets and morphemes. I want them to understand that, and then very importantly, connect meaning, the visual word form analysis, which is
Mm.
basically synthetic and analytic phonics, adding more morphemes to the picture, because the English language, here we come back, how English works, is morphophonemic, not just phonemic. That's
Mm.
another big insight. So, and then how all of that has to become fluent,
Mm.
accurate, fluent, and then connected to what I call deep reading comprehension. So, how the English language works is the third big area. So, reading brain, heterogeneity of dyslexia, and how the English language works for words in the acquisition of written words.
Mm.
Those are
So,
my
Bill.
big items, if you will.
Mm. And so that is a beautiful segue into our next point for discussion, which is perhaps to maybe extend on some of those or other aspects. When we think about your extensive research, what would
Mhm.
you say are the key components that should really be included in any programs that are going to
Yeah.
be particularly supporting students who present with dyslexia?
Yeah. So I know that the field rightly talks about explicit teaching, systematic teaching, structured principles under literacy. All of those are very important. But I add to them multi-componential instruction.
Mm.
And by that, I mean that circuit of circuits needs to be connected for our young children who are not gaining acquisition easily. And it doesn't have to be only dyslexia. There can be all kinds of reasons
Mm.
why that's repeated. But with dyslexia, there are at least two or three major areas that we know need to have work on. But I believe we need to work on five component areas in every single intervention. And as you know, Carla, because you were at my IDA talk on fluency, it's really important for me to say that my last efforts to bring all this to what I call the new RAVE-O Intervention Program can be summarized, just as you're asking me,
Mm.
in the approach called POSSUM.
Mhm.
POSSUM is a way for all teachers to think about the five major components. So in our new RAVO program, we just outright call the O opossum, so that no teacher forgets that every day, whatever program they're doing, whatever combination of programs they're doing, they're trying to connect phonology, the
Mm-hmm.
phonological processes underlying our overarching phoneme awareness, prosody, and phonics methods. So that big P is all of that, but the O is connecting it to orthography, and that's what are the common letter patterns in English. And we liken that to an understanding from a linguistic viewpoint of making sure our children know the major rhymes, onsets, letter patterns, and this connects to the M, morphemes. Morphemes, remember, the English language is morphophonemic. So what we're teaching them is to, if you will, I spy the rhyme pattern, learn those in English for every vowel pattern, the major letter patterns, the onsets, and those letter patterns can be typical letter patterns or they can be atypical. Over time, we're giving atypical. So we've got our STRs, our SQs, etc. But they are linked to the rhyme pattern. And that rhyme pattern then is followed sometimes. In fact, the more over time, they become followed by morpheme endings. So we are starting with the rhyme, adding the onset, adding the morpheme under the O. So the P is phonology, the O is really looking at the orthographic unit and its connections to morphology. So that's our morphophonemic aspect. But now here's where it gets controversial with my own work on intervention in RAVE-O. I actually begin it with the S, semantics. Why? Because I want our children to know that words are meaningful and that words are part of their life. So instead of beginning it with what most interventions rightly see as critical, and that is analytic and synthetic phonics approach, depending on the intervention, we want our children to actually begin with an understanding of the meaning of words. And then we open it up to having to teach the units, the visual units in our work. And then obviously, we, not obvious to you, of course, I mean, you who are listening to this, but obvious to us from a linguistic standpoint, none of this works if you don't understand that language has the structure of a grammar when it conveys all of this in text. And so from the very start, the possum is phonology, orthography, semantics, syntax, and morphology. Those five constituent components, I believe, when connected over time and developing those connections rapidly, ever more rapidly, that's the basis for connecting it ultimately to text reading. Now, unlike other intervention approaches, possum is immediately connected, even if the child is just beginning, to stories. So the most modest stories that nevertheless give a kind of feel for story is what we do. So I'll just give you a very concrete example. We look at the word bat and we look at all the meanings of bat, all of the meanings, and then we analyze it, and then we add morphemes like bat, batted, batting, batted, bats. So they're getting, just from the start. And then we have a little story where a bat, the animal bat, has a bat that it bats. And so we are literally teaching the children that these words work in English in very, if you will, predictable ways. And I think the predictability of the English language has been so misunderstood because, of course, we think, oh my gosh, as George Bernard Shaw, only English can GHOTI spell fish. GH is in the laugh, F, etc. But the reality is that it's the morphemes as well as the phonemes that help us understand how a word
Mm-hmm.
can be read. So we are literally in teaching morphemes giving the secret half of the English language that's often neglected. So possum connected to story is what we call in RAVE-O where science, possum is science and linguistics,
Yes.
meets story, which is back to the love of literature, but story with, and here's, you're probably going to make a segue into deep reading, story as a vehicle into developing those sophisticated cognitive processes under deep reading.
The other thing too that is really cropping up for me, because I like to connect pieces of information, when you went to possum, I just kept going back to the circuits, the circuit of circuits, and I kept thinking about how
That's what it is.
your possum approach is actually activating through
That's
quality
exactly it.
teaching practice the circuit of circuits. So if
That's
we can,
exactly it.
if
That's
we
exactly,
help,
Carla, you've done it. You've done it. I hope your listeners understand this is the insight.
yeah,
Right?
and I think that's the connection that we need educators to have, right? To be able to bridge science or research to practice, science to practice,
Yes.
to understand that actually as interventionists, as classroom teachers, we do actually hold the opportunity in our hands to change or create the landscape. And I'm terming landscape, but I'm actually meaning the reading circuit or the reading network. We have that opportunity through or by which, how we teach. So I really want to take a moment to go to deep reading, because I think this is important. So I would like for you to define for us, what is deep reading?
Deep reading is my effort to pull the hood up of comprehension. So a lot of people think of comprehension as simple understanding what the text says, and there is no simple there. The understanding includes multiple processes in that same reading brain that are developing cognitively and linguistically and affectively over time. So it begins with, if you will, an almost dance in our frontal lobes, making analogies between what we know, our background knowledge, and what we're reading. So the first part of deep reading actually is the most basic one, which is, what do we know? How does that meet the text, what the text is saying? If we're talking about a bat and you don't know it's an animal, it can be an animal, you have lost an understanding of the whole. And so part of our job is to build background knowledge. And part of reading's gift is that it builds background knowledge. And that's what Alberto Manguel meant by the geometric cumulative nature of reading. We're both using background knowledge and we're building background knowledge. But we use that to infer. What is this really meaning? So there's a match between what we know and what we don't know, or what's new. And then there's building inference from that. Now, inference is a super important thing, because in our society around the world, we are not taking the time to understand, to infer what is the intention of what's underlying that text. And thus, if we are not using that, which is absolutely necessary for critical analysis, inference is absolutely necessary, we don't get at an evaluation of the truth of what we're reading. We don't understand that the inference really could be based on text trying to mislead us in what would be, unfortunately, the disinformation that's around. And why is that disinformation? We have to be able to infer, oh, this is advertising. This is to sell me something. This is to make me vote in a particular way. And so that analysis of inference and critical thinking is essential to deep reading. Often neglected in our discussions of comprehension, often neglected is this almost miraculous capacity of reading to help make us empathic. And I've actually changed the E in RAVE-O to mean empathy, because I want people to understand the centrality of what reading gives us in our ability to take on the perspective of others, whether it's in a novel and other feelings and thoughts of characters who we never would be or know about, or other cultures, or other historical times, or other religions, all of these things. The empathic perspective taking dimension of deep reading is essential for our species. And you were so kind as to say that I've gotten these awards on talking about the impact of different mediums. Well, part of it is that I'm so worried that screen reading, if dominant in the acquisition of reading, will prevent, by its just surface, when we're screen reading, we're often just skimming our surface evaluation of truth, our surface inability to use that act of reading to understand others. Our world, just like our brain circuit, needs connectivity.
I
And
can,
we need connections among others who are different from us.
100%. And I can see how I can see how much this means to you. How this is very sort of central. I'm going to say, am I right, from a sense of moral purpose in your work?
Very few people, Carla, actually articulate that with me. So I'm not surprised that a wonderful scholar person like you goes right to the heart. And I think that's part of why I've always had such an affinity for the New Zealand people. You are after moral purpose. And
Yeah,
whether we call it
100%.
moral or ethical, you are after that which makes all human beings fair to each other. And that involves understanding the differences among people. And I remember when I was in New Zealand the last time, I remember some of the work that was being done with the Maori children. And I was just I felt like if only the world could be as intentional in its desire for equality among human beings, to develop the potential of every child in society. So moral purpose is, for me, how do we give every human being their absolute best chance to develop a potential that will in turn increase the humanity of our species?
Mm, mm. One of the things that you said has really, really resonated with me, where you said you were talking about inference, and that it was a super important thing, and that it's super important because it really helps us to understand the intention that's underlying the text. And I think about students that I've taught. I think about students that I've worked alongside but not taught directly, who are not able to really truly understand, or definitely can't infer from a text, for a number of reasons. They don't have the circuitry activating in their brain to be able to lift the words off the page. They don't have the circuitry activating where they can make meaning. They have very limited background or prior knowledge. And so after this chat, I'm seeing inference a little bit like this icing on the cake piece, with really, for students to be able to understand. And my own personal experience is that this isn't just related to text reading, it's also related to interpreting spoken language.
Exactly correct.
It is. And so then, of course, that has a much bigger impact on everyday
Mhm.
life. And so
Yes, it
I just want
does.
to add that because that genuinely has been my personal experience with my son, is that at times there is a lack of understanding of
Mhm.
language, and
Yes.
um, those implications are huge. And if we can understand that this vehicle of reading instruction or literacy instruction is about becoming literate as a,
Yes.
from a
Yes.
holistic perspective,
Yes.
then and not just about sitting down in classrooms being able to read text. It is much, 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 much bigger than that.
Definitely. And I think, especially as we enter a world that's increasingly multilingual, the power of
Mm,
oral language development, the necessity of building oral language development as part of that background knowledge is simply essential.
mm,
We're really thinking very hard about how we connect what we call the oral language processes and their development to how we teach reading.
mm,
So I'm actually thinking out loud with a multilingual expert named Claude Goldenberg, and um, we really have a lot more work to do to
mm,
understand how important oral language is
mm,
in the what you called the holistic, the full panoply of things that we're doing to make literate beings in
mm,
front of us.
mm,
That's a really important point, Carla. And I hadn't, I must say, just to backtrack slightly, I hadn't finished my description of deep reading. I got too involved in my hope to not neglect empathy that I didn't, that I sort of short-circuited critical analysis, that inference and empathy and background knowledge all help become more critical and analytic about what the text involves. So, all of those processes, background knowledge, inference, and empathy, or perspective
mm,
taking, contribute to making a real critical evaluation of the truth or the lack of truth or the
mm,
insufficiency in the text we're reading. And we have to really understand that in this day and age, when AI and Chat GPT and all these, if you will, aids to efficiency
mm,
are not necessarily good for the acquisition and
mm.
development of these deep reading processes. We're skipping steps in
Yeah.
acquisition when we
Mm,
rely too much on these technological aids. I'm not
mm.
saying it's not a binary, it's not either or, but
Yeah.
we must not ever skip what needs to be preserved in those deep reading, possum and deep reading processes. That
Mm,
with there should be no shortcuts taken in the
yeah.
development of those processes. And ultimately, by the time they're in middle school, especially fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade, we want those deep reading processes to, in fact, I will say that in even the first year of our intervention program, we are emphasizing what we call the think for yourself strategies, in
Mm-hmm.
which we want the students to come to a place um, that my dear novelist friend Gish Jen calls interiority, the interiority of the reading act. And that's where we want our readers to ultimately build that from the start. And then by the time they're in middle school, really have it almost the modus operandi. What does
Mm,
this make me think for myself?
mm-hmm.
How do I get insights? How do I get that beautiful feeling of
Mm,
reflection, immersion in the
mm,
reading act that is love? That is
mm,
true love. And so, the deep reading is a set of these many different processes that at the end, when you are developing them in a way that is, I would say, authentic, that's really true to each of those processes, you have space and time to think for yourself. That's really why my first book was called Proust, Proust and the Squid, because it was all about how do we leave the insights of the author behind to discover our own. That's the Proust, one of the major Proustian contributions. But anyway, that's a
when when
quick
you were
view of what
when
I
you were
call the
when you went to inference, empathy, and background knowledge, I actually wrote down metacognition and learner dispositions. So I
aha,
was, yeah, because
great.
I was thinking about, that actually that's where we want to be leading to, is that real,
Yes.
all important ability for our students to go to that place of activating or being in that space of metacognition, and then being aware of their learner dispositions all the way through that learner process. And you've been talking about that in that last little snippet that
Yeah.
you were
It's
using.
a
And the
beautiful
reason
connection.
the reason that I wanted to spotlight that was because we want to build that understanding, don't we, that actually literacy is the on-ramp for success in society. So when we think about what we, and I use the royal we in sort of collective
Yeah.
terms, and in terms of all different stakeholders' influence in the space of building a literate world, and supporting our children and students that are dyslexic, we really, really want them all to get to that place of deep reading, and to be able to enjoy and have the pleasure and experience what it is like to live like that.
Exactly. And one of the things that I know, Carlo, our time is
Mm.
waning, but I want actually to say that at the end of reading, let there be joy. And that's what you're really leading us to. It
Mm,
is the on-ramp. It's
mm.
the on-ramp to intellectual development, which we know about,
Yes. Yeah.
but it's also economic development, social
Mm,
development, emotional development, and just as you said, the development of moral purpose in our species, in our
mm.
young. And we hope so badly. I mean, I look at our world this moment in time, and I just almost beg the heavens to give this this sense of humanity as the real aspiration, not money, not success even, but how can we all contribute to a more humane, livable earth,
Mm,
livable world for all
mm.
people.
Yeah. What a wonderful way to close off. What I'm going to say has been an incredibly special chit chat to end our year in 2024. I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart, Maryanne. I have really enjoyed this connection with you today, and I look forward to the time where we can have you again on New Zealand shores, and
I'd love
and help you to experience our people and our culture a little bit more. So thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing. Is there one last message that you want to share with our listeners here in New Zealand?
it. My last message is thank you. Thank you to the entire New Zealand people for what I have watched over the years as an example of what I most hope for our society, to be good human beings who will always progress through all our inventions, but all our desire to really preserve the very best of ourselves for our young.
Mhm. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.